I worked as a custodian at a middle school for nearly 5 years, almost always on the overnight shift. I'd clock in around 10 p.m. and stay until just before sunrise when the buses began lining up outside. In the beginning, I genuinely enjoyed it. I didn't have to deal with kids sprinting through the halls, teachers filing last-minute complaints, or constant noise. The silence felt peaceful, and I liked being trusted to handle my responsibilities on my own. But over time, I began to realize how different the school felt after dark. It wasn't just quiet, it felt lifeless. The building would creak and groan like it had lungs of its own, and when you're the only person inside, even the smallest sound feels amplified. A locker might suddenly pop, or pipes would bang behind the walls, and your mind would instantly turn those noises into footsteps. Eventually, I trained myself to brush most of it off, but there was one area I never fully got comfortable with: the basement. The school was old, built sometime in the 1950s, and the basement stretched beneath nearly half the structure. Unlike the bright classrooms upstairs, it wasn't finished or welcoming. It was a gray concrete maze of storage rooms and tight hallways with exposed pipes and hanging wires overhead. Some rooms were crammed with outdated desks stacked to the ceiling. Others held boxes of forgotten textbooks or broken furniture no one ever bothered to throw away. A damp, musty smell lingered constantly in the air. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered when they worked at all, and most nights you needed a flashlight just to navigate safely. When I first started, one of the older custodians warned me to avoid the basement unless absolutely necessary. He said it was more trouble than it was worth and joked that it was haunted. I laughed with him, but even during that first week, I felt uneasy down there. It was like crossing into a different world compared to the lively hallways upstairs. Some nights, just walking past the basement door gave me a chill, but since I rarely needed to go down there, I avoided it whenever I could. Then one night, about 2 years into the job, I checked the list of tasks taped to my cart and saw I needed to bring up a stack of folding chairs for an event. My stomach dropped immediately because the chairs were stored in the basement. I stood at the top of the stairwell for a full minute, debating whether I could ask my supervisor to let it wait until morning. I didn't want to seem unreliable, so I grabbed my flashlight and pulled open the heavy door. Each step down the stairwell echoed loudly, my boots sounding almost exaggerated in the empty space. When I reached the bottom, I flipped the light switch, but only a few overhead bulbs flickered to life, leaving most of the corridor in shadow. The air smelled like wet cement and old metal. I switched on my flashlight and moved carefully down the hall. The chairs were supposed to be in the second storage room on the left. The first room was jam-packed with desks stacked dangerously high. The second door was rusted and shrieked like nails on a chalkboard when I forced it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of old wood polish. The folding chairs were stacked against the wall in crooked, uneven towers, some leaning like they could topple with the slightest touch. I crouched down and began pulling them free, trying to carry as many as possible in one trip so I wouldn't have to keep walking back and forth through that basement. I had just managed to lift 4 when I suddenly froze. From somewhere out in the hallway came a faint dragging noise, like someone slowly sliding the sole of their shoe across the concrete floor. I held my breath, still hunched over with the chairs pressed against my chest, straining to hear it clearly. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started. I slowly straightened and leaned my head into the hallway, sweeping my flashlight beam in both directions. The light sliced through the darkness, catching dust in the air, but there was no one there. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it echoed. I stood there longer than I'd like to admit before convincing myself it had to be the pipes settling, or maybe I had scraped a chair without noticing. I carried the first load into the hallway and started toward the stairs. Halfway there, a sudden blast of cold air brushed across my face. It was so unnatural that I stopped mid-step. The basement was always stuffy and stale, with no windows and barely any airflow. This felt like I had opened a freezer door. I lifted the flashlight and scanned the corridor, checking for vents or cracks, but everything looked the same as before. I forced myself to shrug it off, set the chairs down at the base of the stairs, and headed back for the rest. When I stepped into the storage room again, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. The stack of chairs didn't look the way I remembered. They seemed slightly shifted, as if someone had brushed past them. I stared at them, trying to replay the exact angle they'd been leaning. After a few seconds, I muttered that I was just letting my imagination get the better of me and grabbed another armful. As I turned to leave, the noise came back, this time clearer. A dull thump, followed by a slow scraping sound that echoed off the concrete walls. It was coming from farther down the basement hallway. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I pointed it in that direction. About 20 feet away, one of the old classroom doors, one that was always kept shut, was now slightly ajar. My stomach sank instantly. I was certain I hadn't gone near that door. The building was locked tight every night, and I was supposed to be the only one inside. I stood motionless in the storage room doorway, staring at the narrow gap. Every instinct told me to drop everything and run upstairs, but my feet refused to move. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe the latch was loose. Maybe opening another door had shifted the air pressure. I clung to those explanations because the alternative was worse. I hurried the chairs to the stairwell, then returned, this time gripping my flashlight tightly, my hands empty and my nerves stretched thin. The cracked door was still there, open just wide enough for someone to stand behind it and watch. My throat went dry instantly. I moved toward it one careful step at a time, my boots echoing off the concrete walls. When I got close enough, I forced myself to speak. "Hello, anyone down here?" My voice cracked halfway through, sounding thin and fragile in the massive, hollow basement. There was no reply. I swallowed, tightened my grip on the flashlight, then shoved the door open with my free hand and swung the beam inside. The room was empty, just rows of dusty science equipment, old glass beakers, stacked boxes, and thick cobwebs clinging to the corners. No movement, no sound. I stepped in for a brief second, heart hammering, straining to catch even the faintest noise. That's when I heard it again, a slow dragging shuffle, but this time it came from behind me in the hallway. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. Throwing the flashlight beam down the corridor, the light stretched across bare concrete and deep shadows, but there was nothing there. Still, I felt it, that heavy, suffocating sensation you get when you know without seeing that you're not alone. My skin prickled from my neck down to my arms. The air felt thicker somehow. In that moment, the chairs didn't matter anymore. I slowly backed out of the room, keeping the flashlight trained on the hallway, and edged toward the stairwell. When I reached the stairs, I grabbed the chairs I'd left behind and hurried up 2 steps at a time. I didn't stop climbing until I burst back into the main hallway upstairs, breathing hard like I'd run a mile. I leaned against the wall, sweat running down my back even though the school was always cold at night. I tried to reason through it. Maybe it was rats in the walls. Maybe old pipes knocking loose. Old buildings make strange noises. But none of that explained the cracked door. Before returning to my cart, I locked the basement stairwell door behind me, even though policy said it should stay unlocked, and I didn't step foot down there again that night. About a week later, I was mopping the hallway directly above those basement stairs when it happened again. 3 loud bangs echoed up from below, evenly spaced, like someone punching the wall with a steady fist. The mop slipped from my hands, dirty water spreading across the tiles. I stood frozen, listening. A second later, the basement door rattled violently, as if someone had shoved it from the other side. My blood turned to ice. I didn't open it. I just stood there gripping the mop handle so tightly my knuckles ached, waiting for the noise to stop. After that night, I refused to go into the basement alone. If anything needed to be brought upstairs, I waited until another custodian was on shift. I never told them exactly what I experienced because I knew they'd laugh it off or blame it on the so-called ghost people joked about. But I know what I heard, and I know the weight of that presence I felt standing behind me in the dark. Even now, years later, whenever I think about those slow, dragging footsteps echoing through that basement hallway, my stomach twists like I'm right back there again.